Face-to-face conversation in more than a year. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov have had an unexpected meeting on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in New Delhi. The two spoke for less than 10 minutes. While divisions over the war in Ukraine have dominated the G20, the Indian Foreign Minister has confirmed there'll be no joint statement from the meeting, saying they can't reach a consensus. Russia and China were the only two countries to refuse to support a demand for Moscow to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. Bhavni Mittal joins us now from the summit venue in New Delhi. And Bhavni, so they have confirmed no joint communique, and the impasse is obviously very embarrassing for the host nation, who really wanted to shine here.
Yes, the foreign ministers' meeting of G20 nations in New Delhi has ended on a tense and divisive note. There is no joint declaration or joint statement, and this was expected given what happened last week at the G20 meet of finance ministers. And it is because of opposing views held by participating nations on the ongoing war in Ukraine. That is the dominant theme of G20's meeting today, and has been even last week at the finance ministers' meeting. Now, the other big news is that the US and Russia met for the first time, the highest level meeting since the war began. This was not scheduled, but Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov met for about 10 minutes tops. In this, the US reiterated its unwavering support for Ukraine. Blinken also urged Lavrov to reverse the suspension of the New START nuclear arms treaty that Russia suspended recently. Now, Sergey Lavrov held a press conference in which he blamed Western nations for making, quote, emotional statements and derailing the G20 agenda. Lavrov also came in support of China. China was criticized by the United States and by Germany today for supplying weapons to Russia.
What sort of tensions have there been in terms of the way both Russia and the US at this summit have tried to make other G20 nations pick a side?
Well, nations have been reiterating their positions, and we have seen that divide between, countries like Germany, like the United Kingdom, like the European Union bloc sort of double down on Russia, calling it an aggressor, while, countries like China have been pushing, its 12-point peace plan. But the tensions over here have also put the spotlight on India's diplomatic heft and its ability to sort of keep walking that diplomatic tightrope. Countries like India have been importing oil from Russia, even though there are sanctions. India also has close ties with the United States. Now, the other thing to note is that the agenda for India has been to really focus on issues of the global south. New Delhi has viewed this G20 presidency as a golden opportunity to project itself as the voice of the global south. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in today's statement, also urged nations to find common ground on issues like inflation, issues like food security and climate change. Now, India's foreign minister did say that there was some sort of meeting of minds on those issues, but because of, differences over the war in Ukraine, there was no joint statement. The concern now is, and the question rather now is, can India pull off what Indonesia did last year, that is end its G20 presidency on a sort of consensus? Last year there was that Bali declaration, and it does at this point seem to be a tall order to achieve that when world leaders meet for the final summit in September. But if that does happen, it will be a big goal for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, both internationally as well as domestically.
Bhavni Mittal there for us in New Delhi. Thank you. Now, of the 19 countries and the European Union that make up the G20, 15 voted in favour of an immediate end to the war in Ukraine at the UN General Assembly. Russia opposed the motion. China, India and South Africa abstained. Now, China and Russia have no formal military alliance, but they have strong ties based around arms sales and joint exercises. Economically, Russia is increasingly reliant on China. While India's military is heavily dependent on Russian tanks, fighter jets and other equipment. India is the world's third largest consumer of oil and buys it from Russia. South Africa has deepened its military ties with Russia. The two nations held joint naval exercises on the anniversary of the invasion. South Africa described Russia as its friend. Trade between the countries in 2021 totaled about $1 billion. Well, let's bring in Marwan Bashar, Al Jazeera senior political analyst. And it does seem, Marwan, that the foreign ministers from the US and Russia have met and spoken. It seems, for appearance sake, accidentally on purpose.
Yes, absolutely. Not exactly spontaneous, as it were. But it really begs the question, Suhail, why leak it to the press as to what Secretary Blinken told Foreign Minister Lavrov, instead of actually saying it in the open platform in the conference? I mean, it sounds to me like a great point, talking point, for the Secretary of State to tell the Russian foreign minister, why don't you people come back to New START, and let's talk about nuclear proliferation, and let's start about non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And he could have talked about the danger, the escalation of not having nuclear agreements between the two world superpowers and what that means for nuclear proliferation worldwide, since we are talking about other countries thinking about or enriching uranium or becoming nuclear states like Japan, Iran, and others. So it really begs the question, why go on the sideline and talk about that instead of mentioning it in the hall? Because this meeting is meant exactly for something like that. Instead, what we've seen is meeting after meeting after meeting, whether it's the UN Security Council or the G20, becoming a forum for diatribes and bickering, not a place where there is constructive engagement.
Do you think there was this issue of perhaps not wanting to try and embarrass the host, India, allowing them to shine as hosts of the G20, and so therefore this conversation was taken to one side? Because India themselves have had a very difficult line to tread in setting up this whole conference with what's gone on in Ukraine over the past 12 months. And one gets a sense, really, that we're back to the 1970s and 80s and this sort of semi-Cold War, whose side are you on? You're with us or you're not, going on.
Absolutely. Look, as our correspondent mentioned, there was no mention that I know of China's 12 points, which already been turned down by NATO's Secretary General. The Americans, the Europeans are not exactly playing the game. They're not even building on those 12 points that are really just guidelines to, stop the war, and let's discuss how Russia could eventually, come to a peace agreement with Ukraine. And clearly, India's efforts are not appreciated as well, because the West, especially, but also Russia, they want allies. They want with us or against us kind of deal. But that's notably the United States. And hence, it's undermining whatever efforts coming from the Turks, from the Indians, from the Chinese, because it simply wants unconditional Russian withdrawal from Ukraine and into the war that way, and they're not accepting any form of the diplomacy. And in the process, and I must emphasize that because I just saw your list of this hybrid world that we live in with Russia, China, South Africa, Brazil, and so on and so forth, taking these kind of vague, ambiguous positions, wanting to play both sides, to want to hedge their positions. But what is happening in the process, Suhail? Because you talked about military agreements between these countries. What we've seen is that there's an increase in military spending in the world like never before in the history of humanity. This year, in fact, last year, we jumped to $2.2 trillion, $2.2 trillion of military spending. Huge rises of military spending, not only by the United States and Russia, but also by China, Japan, and other parties within Europe and outside Europe. Germany and Japan are arming, right? So there is an arms race being fueled by this bickering that is going on.
But isn't there also another sort of observation here that countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, emerging markets who are part of the BRICS organisation with China and Russia are not don't need to actually say whose side they're on, because The world has changed in 30 years since the fall
Absolutely.
or the breakup of the former Soviet Union, the Cold War, the reduction generally in nuclear weaponry. Different alliances have been made and not necessarily stuck in stone. They're very movable.
Absolutely. That's what I meant by there's a hybrid world that we live in. It's neither gas or electric, right? I mean, it's both. It's neither the United States or Russia. It's both. And it's not just both of them. It's also China, and it's also India. And so countries and governments and regimes, even totalitarian regimes, are finding it easier now to pick and choose. Recent meeting in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh invited China, while it also has a great relationship with the United States. So yes, a lot of mid-sized countries are finding it easier now not to be dealing vertically with one superpower or another, but dealing with more than one power. That's making things easier for these countries. But it's also making it easier in terms of betting and hedging, right? Because let's say you decide to give up on Russia completely, sever relations, and side with the United States. What guarantees are there that in 2025, there won't be a President DeSantis or President Trump that will simply forget about these countries like President Trump did when he entered office? So it is an ambiguous, it is unreliable world, and everyone is looking for their own interest. And no one is looking, really, for the common good.
Indeed, we might say it's a movable political feast. For the moment, Marwan, thanks very much for your insight. Thank you.